A British nobleman is found in his bed with his throat cut. No signs of a struggle, a dull knife, and no attempt to fight back. That should be impossible. But this is how investigators discovered the body of Lord William Russell in 1840, a violent murder scene with zero signs of violence. This contradiction ignited one of Victorian England's biggest murder panics, and almost immediately, the public asked the same question. Was Lord William Russell poisoned before he was killed? To understand why this theory took hold, we have to return to the morning of May 6, 1840. Russell's servants entered his townhouse in Norfolk Street and found him dead in his bed. The sheets were soaked with blood. The wound was fatal and obvious. But everything around him was strangely undisturbed. Nothing in the room suggested a struggle. No broken furniture. No scattered objects. No signs that an elderly but healthy man had tried to resist an attack. In cases involving knives, especially dull ones, investigators expect violent motion, claw marks, defensive wounds, torn bedding, or injuries on the attacker. But in Russell's room, none of this existed. The environment appeared controlled, quiet, and almost staged. This silence became the core of the mystery. The only person with regular access to Russell's private rooms was his valet, François Benjamin Courvoisier. His presence in the household was recent. His duties gave him proximity, and from the moment the body was discovered, his reactions drew attention. Witnesses described him as panicked at first, then confused, and later inconsistent. His statements shifted. Timelines changed. And in Victorian England, where investigators depended heavily on confession, demeanor, and social expectations, shifting details were enough to build suspicion. Yet even with the focus on Courvoisier, the physical facts refused to align. A man like Russell should have reacted. Even minimal movement should have produced evidence of resistance, but nothing in the room suggested he ever woke up. This gap between the injury and the environment is what propelled the story into the newspapers, where reporters amplified the contradiction for a public hungry for sensational detail. To the Victorian press, the dull knife mattered. A sharp blade might kill quickly in a single motion. A dull blade drags. It requires force. It causes pain. It gives the victim time to respond. So how did Lord William Russell fail to respond? By presenting a scene that defied expected physiology and behavior, the case created fertile ground for speculation. And because toxicology in 1840 was primitive, no laboratory could easily confirm or deny the presence of sedatives or plant-based toxins. Most substances could not be detected at all. With that scientific uncertainty, journalists filled the vacuum. Headlines suggested that the attack was too easy. Some articles hinted that Russell may have been incapacitated before the knife ever touched him. Others proposed unnamed drugs or foreign chemicals capable of rendering a man helpless without leaving traces. None of these ideas came from evidence, but the absence of evidence made them harder to dismiss. Courvoisier's inconsistent statements only fueled the speculation. Each change in his account made the public more certain that something had been concealed. And with no forensic tools to settle the matter, the poison theory became the simplest explanation for the calm crime scene. If the knife didn't explain the lack of struggle, maybe something before the knife did. And that is how the idea of a mystery poison became inseparable from the murder of Lord William Russell. A theory built not on scientific discovery, but on a contradiction that Victorian society could not explain. The crime scene of Lord William Russell's murder didn't look like a murder at all. No forced entry, no overturned furniture, no bruises, no defensive wounds, and a dull knife that shouldn't have killed a man without a fight. To investigators in 1840, the room looked less like the site of a violent attack and more like something arranged, frozen, almost staged. When authorities documented what they found inside Russell's bedroom, the list of anomalies grew quickly. The entry door showed no splintering or tampering. The windows were intact. There was nothing to indicate that anyone had broken in. The scene suggested either familiarity or access, not intrusion. Inside the room, the orderliness was even more striking. Chairs stood where they always stood. A mirror remained perfectly angled on its stand. Nothing had been knocked over. Nothing displaced. Even the bedside table looked untouched. For a supposed nighttime struggle that ended in a fatal throat wound, the surroundings were oddly calm. Then came the physical examination of Russell's body. His arms showed no bruising. His hands showed no cuts. There were no signs he had grabbed the attacker's arm, pushed away a blade, or shielded his throat. Defensive wounds are one of the most consistent markers in knife attacks, and their absence instantly stood out. And finally, the weapon, a relatively blunt knife, something that should have required pressure, time, and effort to use effectively. A dull blade usually produces hesitation marks, incomplete cuts, or irregular wounds. Yet here the wound was decisive. clean enough to kill, but unsupported by any evidence of struggle. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Lord William Russell had not fought back. In 1840, investigators lacked the forensic capabilities that modern criminology now relies on. They could describe wounds, measure angles, and record the scene. But they could not test for most toxins. They could not evaluate sedatives. They could not analyze alcohol levels or detect herbal compounds that might weaken or incapacitate someone. They had no chemical assays, no toxic screens, and no reliable methods for identifying subtle forms of poisoning. This scientific limitation created an ideal environment for speculation. Victorian newspapers understood immediately what the public would latch onto. Within days, headlines began proposing explanations. The evidence could neither prove nor disprove. If no struggle occurred, perhaps Russell wasn't conscious. If no resistance was shown, perhaps his senses were clouded. The logic was simple and sensational. A calm room plus a dull knife plus a silent victim equaled a mystery that demanded something beyond a conventional attack. Journalists printed diagrams of the room, pointing out the undisturbed furniture. They emphasized the absence of wounds on Russell's hands, and they repeated one idea so often that it began to feel factual. Lord Russell must have been incapacitated before the killing. The theory spread faster than investigators could contain it. Meanwhile, François Benjamin Courvoisier, the valet, unintentionally intensified the rumors. His statements shifted from detail to detail. His explanations were incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Instead of clarifying events, he created uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the public filled the gaps with what they believed made the most sense. If Courvoisier was guilty, how could he subdue a man without leaving any marks? If he used a dull knife, why didn't Russell resist? And if the room showed no signs of violence, then what made the attack so effortless? Each question pushed audiences toward a single narrative. Russell must have been drugged. Was it a foreign poison brought from the continent? A sedative slipped into his wine? An accidental overdose of an evening tonic? Or something more exotic? Something Victorian Britons feared but didn't understand? None of these hypotheses were backed by evidence, but none could be disproven either. In 1840, the absence of proof was not a barrier. It was fuel. This combination of an undisturbed crime scene, limited forensic technology, and a suspect who could not provide a stable account created the perfect storm. The poison theory was not born from science. It was born from a contradiction that seemed impossible to reconcile with the physical reality of the room. And as the investigation continued, this uncertainty didn't fade. It escalated. What happened next pushed the case out of the courtroom and into the national imagination, transforming an isolated murder into one of the most sensational episodes of the Victorian era. When investigators searched for answers, the clearest suspect seemed to be the man closest to Lord William Russell, his valet, François Benjamin Courvoisier, a young servant, foreign-born, only months in the household, and already contradicting himself under pressure. To the Victorian public, that was enough to turn confusion into guilt. Courvoisier's position within the Russell household was recent and precarious. He was a Swiss valet working for an elderly English aristocrat at a time when foreign domestic workers were viewed with suspicion. This alone framed him as an outsider. And in 1840, being an outsider meant being vulnerable to public judgment. Immediately after the discovery of Lord Russell's body, Courvoisier's behavior attracted attention, not because it proved involvement, but because it lacked the clarity investigators expected. His early statements contained inconsistencies. His accounts of his movements shifted. His recollections changed from one retelling to another. At times he appeared panicked. At other moments hesitant, not calm, not confident, but overwhelmed. To modern forensic psychology, this is predictable. Stress, fear, language barriers, and sudden exposure to suspicion distort memory and communication. But Victorian investigators did not have this framework. In their eyes and in the eyes of the public, uncertainty looked like deception. Fear and guilt were indistinguishable. As news spread, every small inconsistency in Courvoisier's statements was amplified by the press. Newspapers shifted the narrative from confusion to intent. Headlines framed him as evasive. Columns questioned his motives. Editorials speculated about secret thefts, hidden grudges, or foreign methods of murder. The public absorbed these interpretations quickly. In an era with limited forensic tools, character became evidence. Demeanor became testimony. And Courvoisier's anxious behavior became, in the public imagination, a sign of guilt. His shifting statements created a vacuum of certainty, and that vacuum was filled with fear. The more he talked, the more the story around him hardened. The press portrayed him as deceptive, someone who changed details to avoid detection. The public portrayed him as dangerous, someone capable of using methods unfamiliar to English households. The courtroom portrayed him as doomed, someone whose explanations failed to match the physical reality of the crime scene. None of this was driven by hard evidence. It was driven by contradiction. Courvoisier could not explain why Lord Russell left no defensive wounds. He could not explain why the room showed no signs of resistance. He could not explain why a dull knife produced a silent, effective attack. Every gap in his explanation strengthened the suspicion against him. In London's streets, gossip moved faster than official statements. Newsboys shouted headlines that reduced complex uncertainties into simple accusations. Coffee houses and taverns repeated the same phrases: the foreign valet, the poison theory, the strange behavior. And as these ideas traveled, they fused into a powerful stereotype. Courvoisier became, in the public imagination, the foreign servant with access to unknown poisons. It didn't matter that there was no evidence he handled toxic substances. It didn't matter that no poison was found. It didn't matter that the maid, the butler, and other staff reported nothing unusual in Russell's meals or medications. The power of the stereotype outweighed the lack of forensic proof. Victorian Britain was a society anxious about outsiders. Industrial change, shifting class structures, and immigration all created tension. A foreign servant accused of killing an English aristocrat was the perfect focal point for these fears. And because forensic science could not definitively answer the questions surrounding Russell's death, the public filled the gaps with imagination. The idea of poison, mysterious, silent, invisible, became an explanation for every contradiction: the calm room, the lack of struggle, the incomplete statements. The theory did not come from toxicological evidence. It came from a cultural climate built on suspicion. This combination, an anxious suspect, an unfamiliar background, inconsistent statements, and a public ready to believe the worst, produced one of the most dramatic trials of the Victorian era. And although no scientific test ever confirmed the presence of poison, the theory refused to disappear. It became central to how people understood the murder of Lord William Russell. It shaped newspaper coverage, courtroom arguments, and public opinion. In the absence of certainty, fear filled the void. The poison theory in Lord William Russell's murder didn't grow because of evidence. It grew because Victorian newspapers knew exactly how to sell a story: a dead nobleman, a foreign servant, a calm crime scene, and no clear explanation. To the press, this was profit, not tragedy. In the 1840s, London's media landscape was exploding. Dozens of competing newspapers fought for circulation. Crime reporting was one of the most lucrative categories. And sensational crime, cases with ambiguity, fear, or scandal, was the most valuable commodity of all. The murder of Lord William Russell contained every ingredient editors needed: an aristocrat killed in his own bedroom, a servant under suspicion, a scene with contradictions that investigators could not immediately resolve. In a market driven by attention, this combination was irresistible. Newspapers moved quickly to construct narratives that would maximize readership. Headlines were bold, dramatic, and often speculative. They implied conclusions the evidence did not support. The silent killer. The mystery of the unmarked room. Was Lord Russell drugged? These phrases were not summaries of investigative findings. They were marketing tools, designed to provoke curiosity, fear, and repeated sales. Victorian editors understood a simple principle: a clean, dramatic explanation sells better than a complex, uncertain one. And the poison theory provided exactly that. The actual evidence in Russell's bedroom pointed toward a physical attack with a knife. No witness reported that Russell appeared drowsy or intoxicated before his death. No unusual compounds were found near his bedside. No pharmacist recalled dispensing anything suspicious. And no staff member described changes in his behavior or routine. But none of these facts were sensational. By contrast, the idea of a hidden toxin, silent, invisible, foreign, fit perfectly into the anxieties of the time. It made the crime appear not only brutal, but mysterious. It added a layer of sophistication that appealed to educated readers. It transformed an inexplicable scene into a dramatic narrative. And importantly, toxicology in 1840 was primitive. Investigators could not run chemical screens. They could not detect low-dose sedatives. They could not identify many herbal compounds. This meant newspapers could promote the poison theory without fear of contradiction. The scientific tools needed to disprove it simply did not exist. The media's approach was systematic. Articles repeated the same themes: the quiet crime scene, the absent struggle, the dull knife, the foreign servant. Each repetition nudged the public toward the same conclusion: something unusual must have occurred before the attack. The more newspapers speculated, the more the theory solidified, not as fact, but as expectation. Readers began to interpret every new detail through the lens of poisoning. A lack of defensive wounds became evidence of sedation. Courvoisier's inconsistent statements became signs of a chemical plot. Even Russell's age was reframed, not as a natural vulnerability, but as a factor that made him susceptible to secret drugs. This was not journalism. It was narrative construction. Behind the scenes, editors understood exactly what they were doing. Sensational stories boosted readership, which boosted revenue. The goal was not accuracy, but engagement. And in Victorian media, engagement was driven by exaggeration. Nothing illustrated this better than the way papers treated the absence of evidence. Instead of dismissing the poison theory due to lack of proof, they presented the lack of proof as mystery, something that made the story more intriguing, not less. The absence of signs, one paper wrote, suggests a method beyond detection. This was speculation disguised as analysis. In truth, the most straightforward explanation remained unchanged. Lord William Russell was killed with a knife. No toxins were detected. No witness observed unusual behavior before his death. No member of the household reported strange odors or suspicious food. No medical professional identified signs consistent with poisoning. But in media ecosystems driven by competition, the simplest explanation rarely wins. Rumor travels farther than fact. Ambiguity attracts more attention than clarity. And a dramatic theory, especially one involving foreign poisons and silent attacks, dominates public imagination long before evidence can catch up. That is why, even without proof, the poison myth did not fade. It thrived. When the trial finally reached its climax, one expectation dominated the courtroom, that the poison theory would be proven or disproven once and for all. Instead, it collapsed immediately. No witness supported it. No physical trace existed. No medical evidence hinted at sedation. The myth that had gripped Victorian England had nothing beneath it. Inside the courtroom, the facts were far simpler than the story circulating in newspapers. Toxicology was limited, but doctors could still identify obvious signs of poisoning: discoloration, organ irregularities, chemical residues. None appeared in Lord William Russell's autopsy. Nothing in his stomach contents, fluids, or tissues suggested he had been incapacitated before the knife was used. Witnesses from the household reported no unusual behavior on the night of his death. His habits were consistent. His final hours were uneventful. And his physical condition, aside from age, showed no indication of chemical influence. Pharmacists testified that Russell had not purchased or been prescribed anything out of the ordinary. Servants confirmed that no irregular foods or drinks entered his room. No containers, vials, or suspicious substances were found anywhere in the house. The idea of poisoning had fueled newspapers for weeks, but in court it had no anchor. The official verdict reflected this. Lord William Russell died from a knife wound inflicted by François Benjamin Courvoisier. That was the only conclusion supported by material evidence. Forensic limitations prevented full reconstruction of the event, but the physical facts, trajectory, wound structure, blood patterns, aligned overwhelmingly with a direct knife attack. The calm room did not indicate poisoning. It indicated that some assaults, even lethal ones, leave minimal disturbance. But this reality did not satisfy the Victorian public. If the case were judged strictly on evidence, the story would have ended there. Instead, the myth survived, and in some circles grew stronger. The reason was not scientific, it was psychological. People wanted an explanation that matched the strangeness of the scene. A calm bedroom, a dull weapon, no resistance. These details felt incompatible with ordinary violence. The poison theory filled that gap, not because it was supported by data, but because it made the contradictions easier to understand. It offered a structured narrative where the facts seemed incomplete. In other words, the myth solved a problem that the evidence could not. Victorian society also operated under a powerful cultural bias. The idea of a foreign servant using an unfamiliar toxin aligned with fears of outsiders, fears of changing household dynamics, and fears of invisible threats. The theory reinforced existing anxieties, which made it emotionally compelling, even as it remained scientifically unsupported. Sensational journalism amplified this dynamic. Newspapers rarely corrected the implications they had promoted. Even after the court dismissed the poison idea entirely, the press continued to frame the case as mysterious, unresolved, or partially hidden. For many readers, retraction mattered less than repetition. Historically, nothing indicates the presence of a mysterious substance. No hidden toxin, no forgotten sedative, no lost Victorian chemical. What existed was something far more predictable: fear, speculation, and a public eager to believe that a strange crime required an extraordinary cause. The evidence shows none of the mechanisms associated with poisoning, no physiological markers, no trace compounds, no suspicious procurement, no testimony pointing toward chemical assistance. Modern historians reviewing the documents have found nothing to support the idea. The contradiction at the heart of the case, the silent room, the lack of struggle, remains unusual, but not impossible. Some murders, especially those carried out swiftly or against a sleeping victim, produce almost no resistance and leave minimal disruption. The absence of noise does not prove sedation, but for Victorians living in a rapidly changing society, that explanation felt incomplete, even disappointing. The poison myth endured not because it held evidence, but because it offered meaning. It transformed an unsettling crime into a coherent story. In the end, the poison in the murder of Lord William Russell was never chemical. It was the narrative people wanted to believe.